They called it the house that ate its own, but no one ever explained what that meant. Not in words, anyway. People in town just lowered their voices when they said it, glancing over their shoulders the way you do when you're not sure if something is listening. I was born inside that house, in the smallest bedroom on the second floor, the one with the window that didn't open and the wallpaper that peeled in the shape of reaching fingers. My mother used to joke that the house raised me as much as she did. I always laughed with her, pretending I didn't feel the floorboards shift beneath my feet, as if they were adjusting themselves to get a better look at me. From as early as I can remember, the house carried whispers of someone who had vanished long before I was old enough to understand fear. The adults never talked about it directly. They didn't need to. The silence that wrapped around the topic was loud enough. It lingered in the way my mother's hand stalled when she folded laundry, in how my father paused at the top of the stairs as if listening for a memory he didn't want to remember, and in the careful way neighbors avoided looking at the second-floor landing. They insisted children shouldn't hear stories like that, but in a place like ours, secrets were louder than spoken words. I learned about the disappearance in fragments, pieces of conversations not meant for young ears, the kind of hushed muttering that slips through cracks the way cold air does. One rainy evening when I was 5, I hid beneath the kitchen table, tracing the grain of the wooden floor with my thumbs. My mother and aunt were talking near the counter, their voices low, sharp around the edges. I wasn't supposed to be awake, much less listening, but the storm outside made it impossible to sleep. The thunder rattled the windows, and the house responded with groans that pulsed through the walls like it was waking up. Over the storm, I heard my aunt say a name I didn't recognize, Mara, and then, she didn't just run away. My mother hushed her immediately, glancing over her shoulder as if even mentioning the girl might bring something closer. My aunt only shook her head, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling, to the rooms above us. She went upstairs, she whispered, and that was it. At the time, I thought that was it meant death, or maybe that Mara had fallen or gotten hurt. I imagined something tragic and ordinary because ordinary tragedies were all my young mind could comprehend. But there was a particular tremor in my aunt's voice, a fear that didn't match accidents or misfortune. It was the kind of fear reserved for things that don't fit explanations, things that linger in the dark corners of a house that already held too many shadows. Later that night, tucked beneath my blankets, I watched the hallway outside my bedroom stretch and shrink with each flicker of lightning, and I wondered if Mara had once stood where I was, staring into the same darkness, feeling the same unsteady pulse of the house breathing around her. As I grew older, the whispers became less fragmented. Adults started slipping, their tongues loosening during arguments or moments of exhaustion. My father, usually composed, snapped once when I lingered too close to the stairwell. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back with a suddenness that startled us both. "Don't wander up there," he barked, breath unsteady. "Not alone." When he realized how frightened I looked, he tried to soften it. But something in his face betrayed him. It wasn't the fear of a child falling or tripping. It was the fear of something taking me. The fear of a place he knew too well. There was a particular spot on the staircase, the 6th step from the top, where the wood always creaked in a long, bending moan. My mother said it was because the board was loose. But my grandmother, who lived with us only briefly before begging to be moved elsewhere, told me once that it wasn't loose. It was hungry. She said it in a trembling voice that barely rose above a whisper, both hands gripping the armrests of her chair as if not holding onto something solid might make the house pull her in. I laughed then, thinking she was trying to scare me the way old people sometimes do for fun. But she didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just stared at the staircase with eyes that looked older than her age, older than the house itself. What bothered me most wasn't the adults' fear or their attempts to mask it. It was the strange way they referred to Mara's disappearance as though it had happened to the house, not just inside it. Ever since she went, my father muttered once after a glass slipped from his hand and shattered. "It's been different. Restless." I had heard him say similar things before, "It's unsettled today," or "It's acting up again," as though the house had moods the way people did. But that night, his words sank into me differently. Restless. As if something had been taken from the house, or given to it, and it hadn't forgotten. I started imagining Mara, not as a girl who ran away but as someone who had stepped into a place within the house that no one else could see. A doorway that only appeared for her. A hallway that led somewhere it shouldn't. Sometimes, as I lay awake at night, I swore I heard footsteps on the second floor, light, hesitant footsteps, almost like someone pacing, trying to find their way out. When I asked my parents if they heard it too, they told me it was the wind. But I'd heard the wind my whole life. The footsteps were different. They carried weight, intention, familiarity. They belonged to someone who had lived there, breathed the same air I did, until the house decided it wanted something more from her. As the years passed, the image of Mara grew clearer in my mind. I pictured her standing at the top of the stairs, listening to whatever sound had lured her upward. Maybe it was the same subtle hum I often felt in my bones, a vibration so faint you'd think you imagined it, unless you had lived in that house long enough to know its patterns. Maybe she followed it because she thought it was a voice calling her. Maybe she trusted it, the way you trust the walls that shelter you, the ceilings that cover you, the rooms that shape your earliest memories. Maybe she stepped into darkness believing it would guide her somewhere safe. All I know is that everyone pretended she left of her own will, but the more I grew, the less that explanation made sense. People don't leave without traces. They don't vanish in houses that lock from the inside. They don't disappear quietly in the middle of an ordinary evening without a single sound of struggle or alarm reaching the ears of those just downstairs. Yet for Mara, there had been nothing. No scream. No burst of footsteps. No attempt at escape. Only a single, soft creak on the sixth stair, followed by a silence so deep it felt deliberate, and the quiet, satisfied exhale the house sometimes made when it had taken something for itself. The first time I noticed the house shifting, I wasn't entirely sure it had happened at all. I was 9, old enough to question what I saw but still young enough to believe that houses might have their own secret ways of existing. It started with something simple, the upstairs bathroom door. It had always opened inward, brushing against the wall with a soft thud. But one morning, when I reached for the handle, the door resisted. It felt heavier somehow, and when it finally swung open, it pushed outward instead of inward, startling me so much I stumbled back. My mother insisted it had always been that way, her voice tight, eyes a little too bright. She knelt beside me, smoothing my hair down as if comfort alone could convince me I had remembered incorrectly. But I knew what I had seen. I knew how the door had worked every day of my life until that moment. And I knew that houses don't change their bones overnight. After that, small inconsistencies began stacking up like mismatched puzzle pieces. A window that used to show the backyard suddenly overlooked the side of the house. A hallway that felt cramped one week stretched strangely long the next, as though the walls had drifted apart in their sleep. My father blamed drafts, faulty measurements, the natural settling of old wood. But even he didn't sound convinced. He'd hum while speaking, an anxious, shaky hum that gave away more than any words could. The house was changing, bending itself in ways that defied logic, and none of us could ignore it, no matter how desperately we tried to pretend otherwise. One evening, I stood at the threshold of my bedroom, noticing how the frame seemed slightly skewed, like a picture hung crooked on a wall. I stepped back, blinking hard, thinking I was imagining it. But the longer I stared, the more obvious the tilt became. It wasn't broken, and nothing looked damaged. It was simply different. As if the house had grown bored with right angles and decided to experiment with its shape. I looked down the hallway, expecting everything else to be similarly warped, but the rest of the frames appeared normal. Only mine had shifted. Only the doorway to the room where I slept. I told myself that old houses moved over time, that they breathed and stretched like living things, as my grandmother once said. But houses weren't supposed to think. They weren't supposed to choose. And the changes never happened in front of me, they waited until my back was turned, until the lights were off, until no one was around. That made it worse. It made it intentional. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to faint creaks and subtle pops as if the house was rearranging itself just a floor above. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like furniture sliding, or doors clicking shut, or the soft thud of a window being pushed into a new frame. I'd tiptoe upstairs, clutching the railing, but by the time I reached the landing, everything was silent again, settled into place as though nothing had moved at all. Yet the air felt different, thicker, disturbed, as if the space had been stirred by unseen hands. One afternoon, while wandering the second floor, I noticed a narrow hallway I had never seen before. It stretched toward the back of the house, dim and silent, lined with faded paintings I didn't recognize. I wondered if it had always been there, hidden behind shadows or unnoticed in the rush of daily life. I walked 3 steps in before the air shifted around me. A subtle pressure pushed against my back, not forceful but coaxing, as if encouraging me to go deeper. The walls seemed to close in, tightening like a throat swallowing. My breath caught. Instinct screamed at me to turn around. I backed out slowly, never looking away, and as soon as I stepped into familiar space again, the hallway shrank. Not dramatically, but enough. When I returned the next morning, intending to measure it or at least prove to myself it truly existed, the hallway was gone. Only a blank wall remained, smooth and pale, as though the corridor had never been there at all. I began testing the house deliberately, leaving objects in specific positions, coins lined up along the floorboards, books propped against walls, a pencil placed exactly where two boards met. More often than not, the items would be nudged slightly out of place by morning. But not in a way that suggested someone had brushed past or picked them up. It was too precise, too purposeful, as if the house didn't want me keeping track of its movements. Once, I placed a marble at the far end of the hallway, marking the spot with chalk. The next morning the marble was halfway down the hall, resting against the 6th stair. I hadn't touched it. Neither had my parents. But the chalk line remained untouched, crisp and clear, as if the house had moved the marble around the mark on purpose. I never trusted the mirrors in the house either. Reflection seemed slightly delayed, like they needed a moment to catch up. Sometimes the reflected hallway behind me appeared longer than I knew it should be. Once, just once, I thought I saw the hint of a door in the mirror that didn't exist when I turned around. It was gone in the blink of an eye, but the cold that washed over me lingered long after. The night the walls stretched for the first time, I was on my way to the kitchen, delivering a folded blanket to my mother. The hallway, which usually took 8 steps to cross, felt longer. Much longer. I walked and walked, the familiar pictures on the wall blurring together in my peripheral vision. When I finally reached the end, my legs ached, and my chest felt tight. My mother looked up from the table, frowning. "What took you so long?" she asked. I opened my mouth to answer but couldn't tell her the truth. I knew how it would sound. I barely understood it myself. But when I turned around to look at the hallway again, it appeared perfectly normal, short, and harmless. Except it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. From then on, the house didn't bother hiding its changes. Doors opened into rooms that shouldn't have been there. Stairways felt steeper on some days and curved subtly on others. And sometimes, just as I was drifting to sleep, I heard the slow, steady shift of timber and plaster as if the house were adjusting itself around me, creating new spaces or closing old ones, making itself more comfortable or making me less so. What frightened me most wasn't the shifting itself but the realization that the house did it with intention, with awareness, as though it was learning my patterns, anticipating my movements, shaping itself not just to confuse me, but to lead me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. The journal revealed itself to me the same way everything else in the house did, quietly, as if it had been waiting. It happened on a winter evening when the power flickered with each gust of wind. The house creaked and shifted as though bracing itself against the cold. I had gone searching for extra blankets in the old storage room, the one my parents rarely entered. Dust coated everything in a thick, undisturbed layer, and the air smelled like stale wood and forgotten years. While pulling down a heavy box from the top shelf, I heard something slide inside it, a soft thump that didn't match the sound of blankets or old toys. Curious, I dug through the clutter until my fingers brushed against a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and stiff, its pages yellowed like brittle leaves. The moment I touched it, the room grew quieter. The wind outside still rattled the glass, but inside, the silence settled with a weight that felt almost watchful. I sat on the floor, brushing away dust, and opened the book. The first page held a name, my great-grandmother's, and a date written in a shaky hand. As I turned the pages, I realized it wasn't a diary in the usual sense, it was a record, a ledger of sorts, tracking births and deaths in our family over generations. But the way those entries were written unsettled me. Instead of details about lives, the pages focused on the house, its moods, its changes, its demands. The language was strange, a mix of confession and warning. One entry caught my eye immediately. It was about the birth of my grandmother. It said the house accepted her, as if that were a privilege. The entry after that described a moment when she was 5 years old and nearly vanished inside a hall that didn't exist the next day. The handwriting trembled across the page, as though my great-grandmother had written it with shaking hands. Reading it felt like slipping into someone else's nightmares, nightmares that sounded disturbingly familiar. As I flipped through more pages, patterns emerged. Every child in my family had been born in the house. Every one. And everyone had died in it too, except for my parents and me, but there were no entries for us, as if the journal had ended before we existed, or as if the house kept its own current records somewhere else. The deaths were listed with a chilling lack of emotion. Eleanor, age 22, taken by the West Wing. Thomas, age 8, claimed by the attic corridor. Mara, age 17, swallowed between floors. That last one made my stomach twist. Mara, the girl no one talked about. The one whose disappearance haunted the house in quiet ways. Seeing her name written so plainly was like unlocking a door I hadn't been prepared to open. The next pages were filled with observations of the house's behavior. More than once, the writer described the house, testing the family, shifting rooms to isolate someone it wanted. There were notes about unexplained hunger, about the walls tightening after a death, about the floorboards vibrating softly during sleepless nights. One line stood out more than the others, written in dark ink that had bled through the page: "We do not live in this house. We feed it." My breath hitched as I read it again and again, trying to convince myself that the meaning wasn't as literal as it sounded. Houses don't eat. They don't crave. They don't remember. But every instinct in me said ours did. At the back of the book, a folded sheet of paper slipped loose and fluttered to the floor. It was a family tree. Not the clean, pretty sort you see framed in museums or old estates, but a sprawling, tangled diagram riddled with crossed-out names. Many branches ended abruptly, marked not with death dates but with blank spaces, as if their endings were too strange or too shameful to record. At the very bottom, in the smallest handwriting, a note read, "The house grows stronger with each one it keeps." I traced the branches with my finger until I reached the last recorded name, Mara. The line after her was empty, as if waiting for the next entry. As if expecting it. I sat there for hours, the cold seeping into my bones, the house groaning around me as though aware of what I was learning. The journal offered no explanations, no escape plans, no insight into why it had chosen our bloodline or how it had become what it was. It simply documented, as though my ancestors accepted the house's nature the way farmers accept storms or sailors accept waves. But I couldn't. I wasn't raised to believe houses could want things. And yet mine did. I felt that truth settle uncomfortably in my chest as I turned the pages again, forcing myself to read every last entry, every warning, every fearful observation. One entry near the end described a ritual I didn't fully understand. It spoke of binding the house to ensure it remained connected to our family alone. The tone suggested desperation, as if the writer feared what might happen if the bond were broken. There were references to an original pact, some agreement made generations ago that no longer appeared in the journal's pages. Whatever the details were, they had been lost or deliberately removed. But the implication was clear: the house wasn't just alive. It was tied to us, and we to it, in ways I couldn't fathom. As I read, a chill crawled up my spine, the kind that doesn't come from cold but from being watched. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Even the shadows seemed to lean in. I closed the journal and hugged it to my chest, unsure whether keeping it close would protect me or doom me further. A soft creak echoed from above, slow and deliberate, like a footstep too heavy to belong to my parents. My pulse quickened. The house had always felt aware, but now it felt awake, as if my discovery had stirred its interest. I thought of Mara, of Thomas, of Eleanor, of all the names scratched into the journal like offerings. I pictured the house shifting its walls around them, drawing them deeper, folding them into its structure until there was no trace left except a faint echo in the floorboards. I imagined the walls filled with more than plaster and timber, filled with memories it refused to let go of, filled with secrets it hoarded the way a body hoards breath. And as I slipped the journal under my arm and backed out of the room, I could swear the house exhaled, long and low, as if reacting to the weight of the truth I now carried, a truth that had lived in its walls long before I was born. My mother always said the house had feelings, though she never meant it seriously. She'd laugh after saying it, try to smooth over the tension with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But after reading the journal and learning about the others the house had kept, I watched her more closely. I noticed how she hesitated before crossing certain thresholds, how she avoided touching the banister on the staircase, how she sometimes paused halfway through a room as if listening for instructions. It made me wonder if she suspected more than she ever let on. And maybe she did. Because one night, long after my parents had gone to bed, I saw her standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, facing the wall with her hand pressed flat against it, whispering something too low to hear. When I called her name, she startled violently, her eyes wide with a fear that vanished the second she recognized me. She said she was sleepwalking. She said she was fine. But the house hummed faintly behind her, and even in the dim light, I could see the pattern of the wallpaper beneath her palm pulsing, as though responding to her touch. After that, I paid closer attention to the ways the house seemed to react to my mother. It wasn't just the subtle shift in the floorboards when she walked or the soft creaking of doors whenever she neared them. It was the way the temperature changed around her, how the lights dimmed ever so slightly when she entered a room, how the air thickened in her presence. My father, who believed fiercely in ignoring what terrified him, dismissed every strange thing I pointed out. "Old houses do that," he'd say, but his hands always shook when he said it. He was lying to himself more than to me. He knew something wasn't right. He had always known. But he believed that not acknowledging it would keep us safe. I used to think he was naive. Eventually, I understood he was desperate. The house's behavior escalated slowly at first, like it was testing boundaries. Doors would lock themselves behind me, but only when I was alone. Shadows moved in corners where no shadows belonged. I'd hear faint whispers from inside the walls late at night, words I couldn't understand, voices that didn't sound like either of my parents. But the whispers stopped the moment my mother entered the room, almost like the house didn't want her to hear. Or worse, like it didn't need to call to her the way it called to me. One night, during a storm that rattled the entire frame of the house, the lights went out. I was in the living room, clutching a blanket around my shoulders. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the room in pale, trembling bursts of white. Each flash cast long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. I thought I saw something move near the doorway to the kitchen, thin, like a limb sliding back into darkness. I tried to tell myself it was the trick of the storm, the flickering light playing on my nerves. But then I heard it, a low, rhythmic knocking coming from somewhere inside the house, far too steady to be the wind. My father rushed into the living room carrying a flashlight, though his hands trembled so violently the beam shook across the walls. I asked him if he heard the knocking. His face went still, pale, almost hollow, but he didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm and urged me toward the stairs. "Stay in your room," he said, his voice thin. "Don't wander around tonight." But the house groaned then, a deep, twisting sound that vibrated through the floor and rose through the walls like something stretching after a long sleep. My father froze. And then, from the landing above us, my mother appeared. She wasn't holding a candle or a flashlight, yet the faintest glow clung to her outline, enough to reveal the calm, almost serene expression on her face. She didn't seem afraid at all, even though the house shuddered around us. She stepped down one stair, then another, her bare feet silent despite the creaking of the steps under her weight. "It's just settling," she said softly, though the storm outside could not account for the unnatural sounds. She touched my father's shoulder lightly. He flinched. Something in her expression flickered then, a hint of annoyance, maybe even disappointment, before she smoothed it away. That was when I noticed the wallpaper behind her shifting, almost breathing. The pattern swayed gently toward her, as if drawn to her presence. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the entire staircase for a heartbeat. In that instant, I saw the shadow behind my mother, longer than her body, stretching upward along the wall, curving into angles no human silhouette could form. When the lightning faded, the shadow vanished with it. Over the following weeks, the house grew bolder. Doors didn't simply close, they closed in ways that herded me towards certain rooms. The hallways narrowed around me at times, nudging me in directions I didn't want to go. I caught glimpses of things in the mirrors, reflections bending slightly, distorting my outline, stretching my features like the glass was reshaping me to fit something else. But whenever my mother entered the room, the reflection settled instantly, returning to normal as though the house were embarrassed to misbehave in front of her. Or perhaps it felt no need to perform for her at all. I noticed, too, how the house seemed to protect her. Once, a heavy picture frame fell off the wall right above where I had been standing moments before. The nail was bent at an impossible angle, as if pried out with deliberate force. My father ran over, panicked, checking me for injuries. But when my mother appeared in the doorway, the lights flickered gently, a warm pull spreading outward from where she stood, the house calming like a beast soothed by its handler. She touched the frame, tracing the broken nail with a fingertip, and said, "The house didn't mean harm." She said it casually, like she knew for certain. But what unsettled me most was the night I overheard my parents arguing in their room. I had never heard my father yell before. His voice cracked with fear when he said he wanted us to leave, that the house was changing, that I wasn't safe. My mother's voice, however, was low and eerily steady. "We can't leave," she whispered. It wouldn't let us. Then, after a long silence, she added something that chilled me more than any shifting walls or breathing wallpaper ever had, and you know why. It chose us. It chose her. I pressed my back against the wall outside their door, heart hammering, and the house vibrated beneath me, humming in a way that felt almost pleased, as though it were listening too, savoring every word, every fear, every realization it had been waiting for me to understand all along. At first, I thought the house was only reacting to me, as it always had, testing, watching, tilting itself like a curious creature. But after the attic door swung shut on its own and the hallway lights flickered with a pulse that resembled breathing, I understood it wasn't just acknowledging me anymore. It was communicating. Not through words or whispers, but through movement, temperature, pressure, and a strange, rhythmic thrum that traveled through the walls like a heartbeat. Every shift in the air, every groan in the pipes, every draft that curled around my ankles felt intentional, as though the house had finally grown tired of subtlety. For years, I had dismissed these strange rhythms as old building complaints, the natural settling of wood and stone, but now they came with purpose. And the moment I realized that purpose wasn't malicious, but familiar, something inside me buckled. I began to sense things before they happened. Not psychic flashes or visions, but sensations, like pre-echoes of the house's reactions. I would step into a room and already know which floorboard would rise a fraction of an inch or which pane of glass would tremble in its frame. If I moved too quickly, the walls seemed to pull inward, as though bracing themselves. If I whispered, the vents carried the breath like a thread, tugging gently at the structure around me. This was no longer a place I lived in, it was something I was connected to. The more I tried to resist, the more I felt the house adjusting itself to compensate, as though it was learning me the way a living creature learns the rhythm of its own pulse. My mother had once said the house raised me. I was beginning to suspect she meant that literally. The strangest part was how natural the bond felt, even as it terrified me. When the house hummed, low and resonant, I felt the vibration in my bones. When the temperature dipped without warning, it didn't feel like cold, it felt like a question. The doorway seemed to sense my hesitation before I stepped through, widening or narrowing just slightly, as if guiding me or correcting me. At night, when I tried to sleep, I felt a pressure at my back, not like someone watching but like something waiting. And in the quiet hours, when most people imagine ghosts, I sensed the house settling against my thoughts, measuring them, responding to them in ways I couldn't yet understand. The connection deepened the longer I stayed, and though I tried to ignore it, my footsteps began to match the creaking rhythm of the floorboards, as if we were falling into the same heartbeat. It might have been easier to dismiss as imagination if the house didn't respond visibly when I felt something strongly. The first time it happened, I was angry at the isolation, at the memories, at the weight of the place pressing on my shoulders. As soon as the emotion flared, the hallway stretched by an inch, pulling long and narrow like a held breath. Doors that had always stuck suddenly swung wide. Lamps brightened without being touched. The wood under my feet trembled like an animal trying to calm itself. The house was reacting to me with startling sensitivity, absorbing and transforming every spike of emotion as though it were trying to soothe me or shape itself around whatever lived inside me. And that terrified me more than anything. Because if the house was reacting to me, if it was changing for me, then I wasn't simply someone who lived there, I was part of its structure in some intangible, impossible way. As days passed, I noticed patterns. When I felt lonely, the air grew warmer, as if arms were trying to wrap around me. When I felt uncertain, lights flickered gently, not in warning but in reassurance. When memories of my mother surfaced, her laughter echoing down the hallway, her footsteps in the kitchen, the soft hum she used to make while changing the sheets, the walls vibrated faintly, like they were mimicking her presence to comfort me. The house remembered her. And it remembered me. But while her bond with it faded after death, mine only grew stronger, stretching through every pipe and beam like a root system intertwining with the earth. I started waking up knowing things I hadn't known before, where a hidden crawl space existed behind the pantry wall, where the foundation dipped under the porch, where old nails rusted silently inside the walls. They weren't memories, not mine at least, but impressions passed into my mind in brief, sharp flashes. I felt as though the house was sharing pieces of itself, revealing layers I was never meant to understand. I tried to leave once, packing a bag quickly, barely breathing as I moved down the stairs. But when my hand touched the front door, the knob turned scorching hot, not burning me but warning me. The hallway dimmed behind me, shadows pooling like thick ink. The threshold felt impossibly heavy, as though the house had shifted its weight toward the entrance to block my path. The sensation that filled me wasn't anger from the house but panic, blind, desperate panic that tightened around my chest until I stepped back, gasping for air. The moment I did, the pressure released. The shadows receded. The house exhaled. It was then I understood that the bond wasn't about control. It was about fear. The house feared something. And whatever it feared, it believed I was the only one who could stop it. Or the only one it could not bear to lose.